All right. Good morning, all. Happy November 1. Let me see your happy Thanksgiving smiles. Very nice. We'll work on it. Okay. Hey, we're going to do our roll call. We're going to do our minutes and our summaries. And then we have a huge thing for you today. Lots of learning. So going to go ahead and call roll. If you'll just say here, that would be fantastic. Starting with Kelly Abbott. All right, Norma. I see Norma's phone, so we'll put a question mark by that. Michelle Bradley.
I'm here.
Hello, Michelle.
Hi.
Ashley Chase.
Hello.
Hello, ma'am. Anna Cole.
Here.
Thank you, Anna. Jenna, I just saw you.
Here.
Yes. Hi, Jenna.
Hi.
Sergeant Cotter.
Hi.
In the house. Dennis.
Here.
Hi, Dennis. Janelle, we know you're here because you had 150 trick-or-treaters. Dave Hayes. Chelsea. Chelsea here? No? Okay. Kevin Lash.
He's here. Good morning.
Hi again. David Lee.
I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you. Timothy Smelzer. Renee.
Good morning. I'm here.
Good morning, Renee. Beth.
Here.
Yes. Good morning, Beth. My neighbor, Becky, I see you.
Good morning.
Elizabeth.
Here.
Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi.
Lynette. I've seen a lot of Lynette actually over the past couple of weeks, but I don't see her today yet. All right. Then there's me and Jana. Jana's insert. Okay. Is there anybody I did not call? I think I got it.
Brandon.
All right. Oh, Brandon. That's
Yeah.
very crazy that I don't have you. Hi, Brandon.
Hello.
All right. Anybody else that I missed?
Stephanie, this is Norma. I put something in the chat, but I wanted you to know I am on.
Fantastic. I see you, Norma. You're on a train from Barcelona to Madrid. You are a dedicated task force.
I was about to
member,
say,
Norma.
this is maybe a high commitment.
Yeah,
Why
Norma, I
not?
don't know if I would have called in.
I was like, hey, yo, I'm in Europe, but good luck.
Yeah, I would think of you all in my heart, but that would be as far as it would go for me. All right. Okay. Let us move to the approval of the October 11th, 23 minutes. Everyone should have received a copy of those. Are there any edits that need to be made to those minutes? I see no hands. Okay. Seeing no edits, if we could please have a motion to approve the October 11th minutes and a second, and please announce your name as you make those motions.
This is Norma. I make a motion to approve.
Thank you, Norma.
This is Janelle and I second.
Thank you, Janelle. Anybody opposed to the approval and passage of the October 11th, 23 minutes? All right, let the record reflect. We have no opposition to that. Those meeting minutes will pass. Moving on to the meeting recap. Again, you're all familiar with the meeting recap. It is an extended version of your meeting minutes from October 11th. Are there any additions, again, edits that you would like to see made to that meeting recap? All right, I see a lot of no's, no, head shake no's. Okay, if I again could have a motion and a second to pass the meeting recap from October 11th of 23, and please announce your name as you do that motion.
I'll motion to pass. Ashley Chase.
Thank you, Ashley.
I'll second. Becky Miller Updike.
Thanks, Becky. All right, is there anybody who is opposed to the passage of the October 11th meeting recap? All right, I see no one, so that meeting recap will pass. And therein lies my very technical work for the day. Trace, it is up to you.
Thanks, Stephanie. Appreciate it. Good morning, all. Good to see you all. Appreciate y'all being here. And we also have a lot of our guests here today too. So good morning to each of you and excited to introduce you in a little bit. I'm going to hand it over to Jordan to kind of overview what our next steps are. We've got a little bit of maneuvering to do and a little bit of ground setting. So Jordan, go ahead. I'll hand it to you.
Good morning, everyone. As Stephanie said, we have a lot of information download to go on today as we begin our work in our individual subcommittees, either for prevention or intervention. We're still working through slightly how to technically hold both of these spaces for the subcommittees and also record the video so that we can continue to post those conversations online. Hopefully by next meeting, we'll figure out how to do that in breakout rooms. But for this meeting, we are going to have our intervention subcommittee jump onto a separate Zoom line where we can record and work there. And then we will jump back from that separate Zoom line into this line where we'll hold public comment and wrap up for the day. We'll be giving you those Zoom lines as we go, so you won't be missing anything. And you'll have time to do that. We have speakers for both subcommittees today, which is wonderful. We have our guests from Texas and Vermont who are on the line presently. So all of my Texas guests, you're going to come with me into the intervention line. So when I put the Zoom in the chat, please jump onto that line. We'll give everyone a time to get kind of separated and get into their proper rooms. Last meeting, everyone kind of self-selected into a subcommittee, which was great. We got a few messages from a couple members who maybe wanted to switch or pick a different subcommittee, which is fine because we largely had a fairly even division. What we're going to ask today is that everyone, again, please self-select into the subcommittee you want to sit in, but then we're going to ask that you stay there. So today's kind of the final day to pick the subcommittee you want to sit on. Again, we have prevention, which is going to cover everything up until the point a youth leaves a campus, and then intervention, which will cover everything once a youth steps foot off a campus. So that's kind of our dividing line and clarification. Obviously, we'll have some overlap, but that's largely the conversations that we're going to cover there. Once we break into our subcommittee groups, we're going to hear conversations. If you're in prevention, you'll be hearing from our friends from Vermont. If you're in intervention, you'll be hearing from our friends in Texas. Again, everyone has been provided all the materials. We'll record everything. You'll get meeting recaps from both subcommittees so you can stay in touch with what's going on in the other subcommittee. And that being said, I know that we sent you a lot of information. Brian has joined our team. He is wonderful at research and pulling down other states, what's going on, resources and summary guides, but we know that you didn't have a lot of time with them because we're still kind of getting rolling on that process. So the way that the order of the meetings are going to work is this. We're going to go in, we're going to have our presentations by our guests. We're going to do some Q&A with our guests. Then we're going to have everyone in both subcommittees break or effectively go off camera for 15 minutes so you can sit with those materials. You can kind of go through them, you can digest them in lieu of the presentations that you're about to hear. Again, we appreciate it's a lot of materials to come through. When you go and do that, please focus on the summary sheets that Brian prepared for all of you. You'll notice I kind of delineated them in the email. You have kind of the pre-work. That's what I would focus your attention on for the 15 minutes, but also take a look at those resources, those Colorado statute and reg summaries and the child gateway summaries as well. And then after that, once we get all together, we'll come back, we'll do public comment, and then we'll break. Any questions on kind of the order of things or how we're going to move through it? Okay, Trace, have I forgotten anything?
No, I just say, like, to keep in mind as we're listening to, we kind of know that we're like running dual conversations, right? Like you might have more questions for our speakers after you actually look at the materials about Colorado, but just the timing. So we're kind of running this in a dual track here, and we recognize that. So, but we wanted to make sure that we use the most of our time today. So I think our speakers, a lot of them are staying on for the continued conversation, but if not, we can certainly come back. So just want to name that. If you feel like because of the materials you review later, you actually have more questions for how other states handled those things, we can circle back there. So that's all.
Okay, so I'm going to put the Zoom link for intervention. So if you're joining the intervention subcommittee, please click on the Zoom link.
I dropped it in.
Thank you. There
You
twice.
did. You did it both.
All right, Trace, I'm going to hop as well.
Okay, so intervention folks, just click on your Zoom link and then you'll get a link back to come. All right, so let's jump in. We've got a lot of time today, but we also have a lot of information. So like we said, we're going to start with our speakers, and then we're going to move into some Q&A there. and then we're going to move into our materials and kind of back to Q&A. So we imagine that the Q&A will kind of loop together and whatnot, but want to give you all an opportunity to do Q&A before we move
What
from
have you stolen now?
So Brian, Brian is the one who found our folks, put all this information together, and is starting to make sense for us. So Brian, I'm going to hand it over to you to do some introductions, and then let's get rolling.
Thank you. Yeah, so I was really excited when when the task force divided into these two subcommittees, and I went and prepared some materials on policies in other states for intervention for the other subcommittee, and then prevention for this subcommittee. And so you'll see that was the 5-pager resource that was sent out that y'all will have some time to sit with a little bit after the presentations just to review. But we looked at policies in Kansas, Vermont, Wyoming, and Texas. And I was really excited to reach out to folks in Vermont because you can read what exists in statute and regs in any state and not necessarily have a very full picture of what actually is the reality in the state. So I love the opportunity for our friends from Vermont to come graciously give us their time and let us learn and pick their brains a little bit on what things actually look like in Vermont. And then, what lessons from that we might be able to apply in Colorado as we're considering the best policies to create the best system we can. So they were very gracious to come. Tracy looks like is coming from the beach, which is very gracious of your time. I mean,
Yeah,
holiday.
Is that Vermont? Is that what Vermont looks like?
That's Vermont.
Wow. That's beautiful.
But I'll just give a very brief introduction. So this Tracy Casanova and Chris Ward are going to be speaking with us again about what things look like in the state of Vermont. Tracy Casanova is the Deputy Compact Administrator and Human Trafficking Consultant for the Department for Children and Families, which is part of the Family Services Division in the Vermont Agency of Human Services, if I got all that right. And then Chris Ward is the Residential and Special Investigations Agency Team Supervisor, also within the Department for Children and Families, Family Services Division within the Vermont Agency of Human Services. So they're going to be telling us a little bit about what things look like in Vermont, and then we'll open up to Q&A and just a continued discussion. But please, our friends in Vermont, you have the platform. Thank you.
Well, thank you guys so much for having Chris and I here today. We're excited to meet with you and I guess share with you some of the things that we do have in our state. So we are a very small state in comparison to you guys, to be clear. And so our resources I will share are generally look different. So we have a couple of staff secure programs within our state that are not locked facilities. They are staff secure in the sense that they also have delayed locks on them. And we have the ability to issue what's called a stop order on kids who present with high risk situations where we can ask the staff to restrain the youth if they are trying to run away. So some of the things that so in my role as human trafficking consultant for the division, I consult on all investigations regarding sex trafficking of minors. And I consult on at-risk youth as well. So that's really the population that I have involvement in when they're placed in some of these staff secure programs. And some of the things that I'm taking into consideration if I'm asking for a stop order to be placed on some of these youth, I'm factoring a few things to kind of assess their risk to themselves, not necessarily a risk that they might pose to the community. And actually, before I explain that, I want to provide one context about Vermont because we are a very unique state in that we do juvenile justice and child protection all within the umbrella of DCF Family Services. So we serve multiple different population groups all within the same programming at the time. So in these staff secure programs, we might have youth who are on probation, and then kids who are in our custody as dependency cases for child abuse or neglect, or in Vermont, we have a statute in our dependency proceedings that falls under beyond the control of a parent. So just to give you a little bit of a context, and we don't do parole. That's just not part of our youth justice statute. Our version of parole as a graduated sanction can sometimes look like a youth on probation coming into DCF custody as a dependent based on their delinquent acts. So just to let you know about those populations that we're serving all within the same facilities. So when I'm thinking about a youth who might be going to one of these staff secure programs, I am taking into consideration their run history. What was the age of the first time that youth ran away? What was the frequency and duration of the runs? Where have they been going? Is there a pattern? So sometimes when kids run away from placement or from when they were living at home for a family, they might be just disappearing for like a few hours during the day and then coming back home. And then it might start increasing to being gone for the whole day or being gone overnight or for 1 or 2 nights. And then it starts building to longer, and that they're getting found farther and farther away from proximity to home or with people that aren't as known to them at that time, which presents more risk for them to being trafficked if they haven't been trafficked already. And so I'm also taking to consideration, are they gang involved? Are there concerns around gang involvement, drug trafficking? Who are the people that they're connected to? Are there people with violent histories who might come pick that youth up if on the corner? So those are things that I'm taking into consideration when I'm potentially reaching out, asking for a stop order to be placed on a youth, because their risk of like, if they were to run away is much higher. And based on those sets of circumstances, we developed as a result of the Families First Prevention Act. One of the things that we did here in Vermont is that we created a screening tool to screen for risk of sex trafficking of minors. So that is something that I will frequently do during my consultations. And I will say, as like a lot of the youth who are in our custody are score high risk for a variety of factors. Some of them are static and some of them are dynamic. But just because you score high risk doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to be recommending a stop order, but it does play a role into like thinking about this child as a whole and the risks that that we need to be paying attention to and planning around. So that is just a little bit of a context, as well as like, if I will say, like, if kids are running away and crossing state lines, and I'm not talking about like, you know, your bordering counties where you can like see the other state from your office, because that's different. But like when kids are running away and crossing state lines and multiple state lines, that really concerns me, that their risk is much higher. They're generally traveling with people that, while they might think they know, are, as adults, we would consider strangers, who are not known to them in ways and are likely going to try to exploit them. So that's another factor that I'm considering, is if they are running and being picked up across state lines. So those are sometimes when we use those staff secure beds, is when kids are returning from those being picked up out of state. So that's a brief summary in terms of things that I'm doing in my role. I'm the only person in the role of any of the roles that I serve here in Vermont. I know in Colorado, you guys are decentralized. And so for, it's gonna look very different. So that's my end. And then I'm gonna pass the mic over to Chris, and then he can talk a little bit more since he is in our licensing unit.
Sure, thanks. I'm more than glad to have folks raise hands and ask questions too. Don't feel hesitant to interrupt me. Chris Ward from Vermont Department for Children and Families, and I work for, as Brian said, the Residential Licensing and Special Investigations Unit. We're a central office unit within Vermont's Child Protective System, and our unit licenses and regulates all of the residential treatment programs in Vermont. And so when I say regulate, I mean there are licensing regulations that programs are required to follow. And so part of my job is to assess and ensure that the programs that are licensed by the state of Vermont are following the licensing regulations. We're also an investigative unit. So if there's a allegation of child abuse or neglect that gets accepted for investigation here in Vermont that was somehow located within a residential facility or a foster home or a school, our unit does those investigations, as opposed to the district offices, which do investigations within, private family homes. So that's the role that I have. I spoke a little bit with Brian Kelly and Jordan Steffen leading up to this to sort of try to gather an understanding of what it is that you're curious about and what it is that you're wrestling with and thinking through right now. And please correct me if I'm off base on this, but I do understand that there have been a couple of tragic situations in which youth have died as a result of runaway from facilities of some sort. And I do see that Kevin Lash and Elizabeth Montoya are on this call, and I just want to acknowledge the seriousness of the whole thing. And I appreciate the advocacy that you've obviously done in Colorado. I really applaud that. So we have regulations within our state, which are were written by our agency, but then promulgated by the Vermont legislature. So they carry the force of law in Vermont. So our regulations are basically law. So that gives us some leverage and some power to enforce the regulations. Our regulations in Vermont allow for physical intervention with youth, that is like a physical restraint or a physical prompt or a physical escort. I mean, basically it means a staff member of a program is putting their hands on a youth in some sort of physical way. And that is allowed in our regulations only for the purpose of ensuring the child or another child's or a staff member's immediate safety. And so in Vermont, I mean, it's a human rights and a civil rights issue. I do not want to see kids hurt or unnecessarily restrained or, subjected to some sort of cruel or unfair punishment or treatment. On the other hand, if a child is significantly at risk of hurting themselves or another youth in the program, then I do want staff to stop them from doing that if the risk is serious enough. And so that applies to situations where kids are aggressive and aggressing on another youth or a staff member. It also applies to situations where children are at risk of suicide, killing themselves. If a youth makes a significant suicide attempt, we expect a staff member to physically stop them from doing that if possible. And now that we're grappling with the questions of runaway youth, we're considering the risk that is involved with a run. And in that way, if we can justify that a youth is at risk of significant danger if they run away, then in a similar way, we would expect a staff member to stop them from doing that. And that's what Tracy was talking about when she talked about a stop order. Within our Vermont regulations, we have a carve out for a secure residential treatment facility, which means an architecturally secure building that's locked that a kid can't get out of if they wanted to. We had one for many years in Vermont, and it closed about 3 years ago in 2020 under significant pressure from our Vermont community, the media, lawsuits, because it was a corrections-oriented facility and it was problematic in terms of some of the treatment for youth. So it did close down, and it still has become clear that we do need a residential facility that's locked here in Vermont. There are certain youth who are accused of what are called Big 12 crimes, including murder, and those types of crimes, we can't just put them into a foster home or a regular group home. We need something that's more secure for them. So we are currently in the planning stages of building a new secure facility. Process like that takes years, and so that's what we're engaged in right now. In the meantime, we have some facilities, as Tracy referred to, which are not considered secure or locked facilities, but they do have delayed locks on their doors. which means that there's like, the bar that you would see on a door that you push the bar to open the door. And when you push that bar, there's a 15, 20, or 30-second delay before the door actually unlatches and then opens it. That delay is, of course, a fire safety mechanism where we're not able to lock a kid in a building that's not sprinklered because it's not safe for fire safety. But that 15 or 20 or 30-second delay frequently affords staff the opportunity to engage in some sort of de-escalation attempt with the youth, attempt to say, hey, what are you doing? Where are you going? Come on back in. Let's talk this through, kind of a thing. And sometimes that 15 seconds is enough to stop a kid from running out the door. If a youth does leave, we typically would expect a staff member to follow the youth. And if they're gone for more than 3 hours, we expect them to report that to us. And in our regulations, they're also required to report to the youth's parents or guardian. So reporting to us as the state licensor, and then also a report is required to the child's parents. That's a brief overview of what we do in Vermont that I think is relative to what questions you're grappling with. But please let me know if you're looking for other information.
I've got some questions scribbled away, but I'm very excited to have the task force pick your brain. If they have anything pressing, please go for it.
Can I actually just add one quick thing? So the programs that Chris is talking about, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I think one of them, one of our staff secure programs that's in the town of Bennington, and then we have a couple of others. I believe those are all for kids who are in DCF custody, correct, Chris? Or is ICAP? So all of these placements, they are not necessarily for use for kids who are not involved in our child protection or juvenile justice system. So I think that's one caveat to be aware of. We do have residential programs who work with kids who are not involved in child protection or juvenile justice. And so I don't know if it would be helpful for Chris to talk about those programs and what they do. But the programs that we were referencing are only for kids who are in our custody.
That's almost exactly right, Tracy, but the Washington County Mental Health Program, TROC, does take a mixture of youth who are in DCF custody and kids that are referred through the Department of Mental Health who are not in state's custody. So we do have a little bit of mix, but Tracy's absolutely right. By and large, the residential treatment programs that are staff secure are serving just kids in DCF custody.
Has that been a problem at all? I mean, I'm coming back to my son. We knew he had mental health problems, and needed a secure facility long before he was in the juvenile justice system. We knew he was going to end up there, and of course he did. And so he kept running away from facilities before we could get him his felony that he needed to kind of spring the kind of facility he needed. Is that a problem for parents in Vermont? And I do notice, I just checked the populations. Vermont's about 10 times bigger than Colorado based on population. So there's a scale issue between the two states, obviously.
Thanks for the question. Good question. I will say that yes, it's been historically problematic that we have a facility. When we had our locked, secure facility in Vermont, it was serving kids who were adjudicated as delinquents who had committed some sort of crime and became adjudicated. It was also serving kids who had such significant mental health issues that they were dangerous to themselves or others, not necessarily adjudicated as delinquents. And there are very different treatment and supervision needs for those different types of kids. I also wrestle with the fact that it's always struck me as this sort of dichotomy between, well, this is a kid with mental health issues and this is a kid with behavioral issues. And really, I see so much overlap between the two of them. The kids that are adjudicated as delinquents certainly had their own mental health issues for sure. And the kids that were deemed sort of just like the mental health kids frequently committed crimes and became adjudicated delinquents. And so I see our system, DCF, and our Department of Mental Health system in Vermont wrestling with, is this a kid who has mental health needs, or is this a kid who has juvenile delinquency type behavior? And really, there's just so much overlap between the two of them that you couldn't really tease out the difference between the two of them. But yet, at the same time, the problem was we had them all in the same program, and a program it's hard for a program to be really good at two different things, you know? So the program was really good at dealing with kids with conduct disorder behavior and delinquency type charges and behavioral issues, but they weren't very good at dealing with kids that had significant mental health issues, and vice versa for the programs that have sort of more of a specialty with kids with mental health issues. They're not as hardened, you know, in their buildings to take the bouncing around the room that that these kids with serious behavioral issues present. I don't know if that was anything close to the answer to your question.
I mean, I'm a little surprised by your answer. Just from I sat for briefings that basically the statistic of 70% were the same kids, and I've also been told many times as a parent, oh, you know, why are you sending him to this program early on? Why are you sending this program for adjudicated youth? And the answer came back because he had treatments exactly the same. Maybe they were just doing that to appease me, but that's something I heard a couple of times. The treatment's the same, it's the same issues, and there's a 70% overlap, and that's why we're sending him to this program for adjudicated youth. This is before he got into the juvenile justice system. So anyhow, just interesting.
Yeah. But certainly I'm not familiar with that program. But it makes sense.
Yeah.
And I do think that there's probably likely at least a 75% overlap between the two. But what I saw here in Vermont is our program that was set up with more of a corrections oriented approach was not particularly good at treating kids in a trauma informed way when they had significant mental illness. Sorry, Tracy, if I overtalked. Go ahead and jump in, please.
So I think one of the things that does make us unique that a lot of states aren't able to do is that we have in our statute that kids should not have to enter our child protection system in order to access residential treatment care. And so that process is through what's called a coordinated service plan. So any child who is a resident of the state of Vermont, if they need a higher level of care, their team can call a CSP meeting, a coordinated service plan meeting, and that includes the school, the designated mental health agency, the parent, DCF, our department, to come and meet to talk about the needs of the child, their strengths, their weaknesses and areas, and if they need residential care, then the team can send that request up to the state level to this committee that's called the Case Review Committee, that consists of members from our department, the Department of Mental Health, the Department of Education, DALE, which is the Department for Aging and Independent Living that holds kids with developmental services, and the Federation of Families. And so they meet every week and review cases to see if kids who need residential care, whether or not they meet that threshold. And so they're the ones who ultimately approve those placements for residential care, and they do what's called a clear, and they let the teams know of, we think based on the challenges or the profile of the youth that's being presented, they will tell them which programs they can seek out for potential placement. So kids are able to access in and out of state residential treatment who are Vermont residents, regardless of their status with child protection or juvenile justice. And I know in some states that internal structure doesn't exist for funding for residential placement for kids. So the Department of Mental Health and Agency of Education, as well as DALE, they have access to all of the programs that DCF contracts with. So they're able to access the same residential programs that we're able to as well.
Thanks,
I
y'all.
see a couple
Yeah,
of
I'm
hands up,
gonna jump in. No, you're good, Elizabeth, and then we'll go to Brandon.
Thank you. I think so the question I have would be about your facilities that kids go to that are not under state custody, because my son was voluntarily admitted to his his residential treatment program a couple of different places because of his running behaviors and suicidal ideation. So the only involvement that the state had was we were on Medicaid. So the care coordinators that approved the Medicaid funding were the ones that were recommending these different facilities or helping me decide on placement. So the places that the kids go that are not in your custody, I'm curious to know what their restraint guidelines are.
They would be the same if they're licensed by our agency, if they're DCF licensed as a residential treatment program, or RTP, we usually call them. As Tracy was saying a minute ago, the RTPs throughout our state can take a mixture of youth that are in DCF custody, or they're referred through the Department of Mental Health, not in DCF custody, but the same regulations apply. So that everything that I said about, required to intervene physically if a kid's about to cause significant harm to themselves or others, same regs apply. Requirement for the program to notify family if a child runs away, same regulations apply.
So in Vermont, DCF, our department is the licensing body that licenses all of the residential treatment programs. So if a program falls under a residential treatment facility, then our department is the regulatory and licensing body that licenses them.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification. Brandon, then Brian, and then Stephanie. And Brandon, can you hear me? We can't hear you. All right, I'm gonna move to.
Can you hear me? No?
Yeah, now I can. Yeah. And hey, I was just realizing, yeah, can you introduce yourself too, just for context, folks moving forward, just so that our speakers know who y'all are. Go ahead, Brandon.
Yeah, I'm Brandon Miller. I'm an executive director for a psychiatric residential facility out here. I have a few context questions. One, the first, your runaway problem, do you guys consider it a significant problem? How often do your facilities deal with runaways in Vermont? The second, I guess, kind of question I have is how big are your facilities? And then the third is about the stopgap. Who has the authority to request that, issue that in your state?
I'm not sure who best to answer. Tracy, feel free to jump in. Mostly I lean on you, Tracy, to talk about how big of a problem it is and how often we see it happening.
That's a complicated answer for me. So I'm going to start with our programs are relatively small, for the exception, I think, of VPI, our Vermont Permanency Initiative, and New England School for Girls, that's a bit larger. Most of our programs, they look like houses. They're not in your communities. You would look at them and you would not know that they are a residential treatment facility. In terms of the scope of how big is the problem of runaways, the reason I'm saying it's it's hard for me to answer that question. We have a policy here in Vermont that I shared with Brian whenever we met, that talks about our response to kids who are in DCF custody. We have a requirement in our policy of notification of what steps workers need to be doing when a kid in our care runs away. And part of that process is there's supposed to be a statewide notification to everybody in our division about the youth that's run away. What I can't speak to is kids who are not in our care who are running away from residential programs. I will sometimes learn about them through law enforcement, or we have a wonderful partnership with the Vermont Intelligence Center here that is housed under public safety. And so sometimes they will reach out to me if they're concerned about a situation. Generally, it's around trafficking. And sometimes I'll see, sometimes the media will pick up the information about a youth being missing. That's for a kid who's not in our custody. And sometimes that's how I learn about it. So I can't speak to the frequency of kids who are not in our custody who are running away from residential programs. And I'm not sure, Chris, if you have that information. I can say one of the treatment programs here in Vermont that's a wilderness program, I've never, it's not to say that kids don't run from their program, but I don't have the knowledge because there's not a requirement to report to me that information.
I can be a little more specific about it. I would say it occurred. I get notification of a kid running away, and as I said before, they're required to notify us if a kid is gone for more than 3 hours. So if a kid busts out the door, walks around the block 3 times, and then comes back and says, "All right, I'm cool now," they don't need to tell us about it. But if the kid is gone for 3 hours or more, that's when we cut sort of the line and say, you have to let us know about it. It's not an incredibly frequent thing. I'd say I get a notification of a kid running away about once a month throughout the year from the 25 or so residential treatment programs that there are here in Vermont. Probably about once a month or so, I'll get a notification, more in the summertime. But what it is in terms of frequency is different in terms of what it is in terms of intensity. Like if a kid is really gone overnight or multiple days, it's very nerve-wracking and it's very serious, and we don't know where the kid is, and it's like it's the ultimate legal and ethical liability. So we take it very seriously, and notifications go out to all of the workers. Tracy's right. We don't have statistics on youth who run away who are not in the custody of the department, but I do get notifications for them running away from residential treatment programs. I'd say once a month or so is the frequency. I would also say, in terms of the question from Brandon about how large our programs are, Tracy's right, they mostly look like houses. To give you a specific number, most of our programs are licensed for 6 or 8 or 10 kids. The Vermont and New England School for Girls that Tracy referred to as our largest program is licensed for 50 kids from the New England School for Girls and 20 kids for the Vermont School for Girls. That's on one campus, and that's by far our largest program. So we don't have any programs that are like 200 kids or anything like that. There's nothing like that in Vermont.
The one thing that I can say in terms of the number of kids on the run, we have had the experience with the duration of kids being missing from care longer than we have historically over the last couple of years. And that we've had, I can say right now, hands down, more boys missing than girls than we have in a long time. In previous years, there's been a flip, that it's been primarily girls who've been on the run versus boys. And for Vermont, typically we would be really good about finding our kids between like under a week time, under 7 days of being missing. And now we're finding more common for kids missing from care for at least a month. And so I know in bigger jurisdictions, like being gone a week isn't a big deal. I think it's always a big deal. A week is a long time, and a lot of things can happen to a youth when they're on the run as to what they're having to do in order to get their basic needs met. So a week is a long time for us. And so those are some of the trends. And we've had like 3 or 4 boys missing right now consistently every month. So who are being gone longer and longer. So
I want to make sure we get to that last question. I apologize if I missed it, but Brandon, you had the question too around the authority of the stop. Who's doing that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good question. There's nobody that sort of grants the authority for it. The way we frame that in Vermont is that I tell the programs, you got to follow the licensing regulations, and the licensing regulations say you can only intervene physically if the kid's about to really hurt themselves. And so as long as they're doing that, they won't find themselves, we would cite them with a violation if they did something that was outside of the realm of the regulations. So nobody's really giving permission or not giving permission. The program is making a clinical and sort of supervision type decision about whether we need to stop this kid or not. If it comes to my attention and I find that they're physically intervening unnecessarily, then we would cite them with a violation of the regulations. On the other hand, if we find out that they're physically intervening and they have a logical, clinically sound reason why they did the physical intervention, then then they wouldn't be, find themselves in violation of the regulations. So it's not like, there is a lot of communication between the program clinicians, program directors, and me in our unit. And, they will say, hey, we've got such and such a kid who's been referred to us. They're at serious risk of being hurt if they run away. This is a kid that we'd likely stop if they tried. And I'd say that makes perfect sense to me. You're not going to have any problem with me if you do stop them from running away. You might have a problem for me if you don't stop them from running away. So that's kind of how those conversations go.
Just to follow up on that, so the factors that you would take in consideration, like suicidal behavior, like their intellectual capabilities, things of that nature, would be the stuff that you guys pre-coordinate together between you and the facilities on whether this is an appropriate kid to stop.
Absolutely. Yep, that's
So-
exactly right. All those factors come into consideration: age, developmental level, history, their risk to self-harm, their risk to, suicide, kids with significant opiate use. We've seen countless fatal overdoses in Vermont, just like all over the country. So if we have a kid who says, I'm just going to run away, find myself heroin as quickly as I can and do as much of it as I can, again, justified. Don't let that kid run away. Can't have that liability, legal or ethical liability.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and I'm
We
not
also
sure if
have
this-
a special,
ahead.
so we have a special team here in Vermont. They're called our Specialized Services Unit. They're the unit that is in charge of like matching kids with programs. And they oversee these some of these staff secure beds. And so they're the ones and also main communication with the programs, kind of sometimes being more explicit on like, this would be a case that we would want you to like to do that, because they're the ones communicating with the programs to see whether or not the programs would accept them into their program. So those conversations are usually happening at the beginning before that youth even steps foot into their program.
I'm looking to, like, I think for task force folks, like if there's interest around a certain policy or procedure or something that isn't quite captured in the document, that's something that we could follow up with. I'm assuming Tracy and Chris, of like, hey, could you get us kind of in the weeds on how you implement these these stops, et cetera. That's something that maybe we can that y'all can just request and we can follow up with.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. Gonna go to Brian and then Stephanie.
I've just got a quick question, and feel free to either ballpark it or just tell me you don't know. But thank you for pointing out how the mixed community is different from the general jurisdiction of this task force, which is non-adjudicated youth. I was wondering about the use of stop orders, and do you have a sense of like what percentage of youth are they really common or are they more rare? And then any instances you're aware of for non-adjudicated youth having a stop order, or just what like extra consideration that status might bring into the consideration versus maybe an adjudicated youth, just to speak to that nuance so that Colorado knows, what the applicability of these circumstances.
And what exactly is a stop order? I think I know, but I want to make sure I know.
Tracy, when she said stop order, is referring to sort of this, the concept of stopping a kid from running away if they try to run out of the building. In general, we don't want staff putting their hands on kids. It's dangerous and it's not therapeutic, and the kid can get hurt and the staff member can get hurt, and the whole rest of the milieu gets thrown off and escalated by the scene. So we don't want we don't want staff putting their hands on kids. But the stop order idea is if a kid runs away, there are certain kids that poses enough danger that we want to stop them from getting out of the building. Our licensing regulations apply to all programs, regardless of whether they're serving kids who are adjudicated as delinquents or kids that are just simply in DCF custody as a child who's been abused or neglected, don't have a delinquency charge. Also, same exact regulations apply for kids who are not even in the custody of the Department for Children and Families. They're there through the Department of Mental Health. They're not in our custody, but all of those same rules apply. So they would handle those kids exactly the same, depending on each individual kid's individual needs.
So their delinquency status isn't going to necessarily automatically qualify them for like a program taking into consideration whether they should stop them. There might be like some significant, I'm trying to think of a time of like just solely based on the charges. Those programs have the ability to say, no, we don't think this youth is appropriate for our program, and they pose too much of a risk based on their delinquent acts and what they're being accused of. And so, but just being a delinquent doesn't automatically qualify anybody for saying like, you need to stop this youth from exiting the building.
And the frequency of it, I would say, has totally blown up since the closure of our secure facility. When we had an architecturally secure building, there was no like, stop the kid from running out the door. Any kid who was so dangerously at risk of hurting themselves because they might run away, they would go to Woodside, which was the name of our secure facility. In that locked building, there was no need to discuss stopping them if they tried to run away because it was built like a prison. You couldn't run away. Well, a kid did escape from Woodside a couple of times, but it was extremely rare.
Appreciate that. Stephanie, I'm going to come over to you and then Renee.
Great. Yeah, it goes back to the stop order. And, Tracy, you talked about criteria, I believe from a screening tool that you use in the human trafficking context. And I think that part of what Colorado's struggle is this definition of emergency. Our law doesn't seem to read terribly different than yours insofar as that we can do restraints or seclusions in case of I think it's imminent emergency, safety to self or others, right? So the problem is our regulators and our facilities, everyone interprets emergency differently, right? Some people are like, the minute a kid leaves, that's an emergency because they're vulnerable, right? Other regulators are like, no, they have to have destroyed a room before you can cease, right? Stop their activity. So digging into that nuance, I guess I'd like to understand, do you have criteria? Do you have anything in law or reg that helps facilities and or regulators have a better mutual understanding of what actually constitutes an emergency and what doesn't? Because therein is our problem. And Chris, I really appreciate when you say, that those are the things that you're required to do in your state. But I will tell you, there's big disagreement here on what that means. And as long as that exists, we are going to continue to struggle to decide when we can stop kids and when we cannot. So I guess I'm just asking either one of you, do you have specific written guidance or checklists that the facility and the regulator can go through so that there's agreement in advance before these stop orders are issued?
I'm going to defer to Chris on that in terms of the
and I'm
licensing.
going to say, Stephanie, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's right on the money. It's a subjective assessment at a certain point, and there can be 100 different smart, thoughtful people that have their hearts in the right place, and you get 100 different answers about where exactly that line is where you should physically intervene. Our regulation says restraint shall be used only to ensure the immediate safety of the child, youth, or others when no less restrictive intervention has been or is likely to be effective in averting danger. Restraint shall be used only as a last resort. And so that is sort of what we grapple with. So many situations are in the gray area, and different people might have different assessments of whether it was appropriate to physically restrain or not. And it's a frequent topic of conversation between me and the residential programs that we serve. Comes up with questions about notification. I mean, they're required to notify us if something happens that puts a child in potential danger. They're required to notify us, and it's like, well, what's potential danger? Like they cooked something and they might have burnt themselves while they were cooking. Is that potential? And so we end up saying things like, anything where there was a siren, like if there was a siren, if there's a police siren, an ambulance siren, a fire truck siren, anything with a siren, we want to know about it. We end up saying, sort of general rules like that. When do we need to inform you if a child runs away? Well, we say the 3-hour mark. 3 hours is about right. But however, we have residential treatment programs that serve 6 to 8 to 10-year-olds. I don't want a 6-year-old to be gone for 3 hours before they do something about it, So our regulations are in some ways purposefully vague to not lock programs into specific things that they need to do if that thing is not appropriate to that program. But it opens it up for all kinds of argument when there's subjective opinions of what we should be doing.
All right, and just very quickly, because I don't want to take up all the time, when you talk about the delayed gates or the delayed locks, have you found those to be effective in at least creating a space and time, right, to intervene in that running event?
No, I frequently see incident reports from programs that say that, the youth got really escalated, said, F you, I'm out of here, went heading for the door, you know, hit that bar to the door. And then it's like, it can't really go anywhere for 30 seconds. And, you know, 15 seconds seems like a short amount of time, but it's actually a long, you know, it's 15 seconds it's a fire safety thing. So 15 seconds can be very long time if your building is on fire. It's a decent enough amount of time for a staff member to be able to get right up to the door, to be with the kid, to sort of begin to try to engage the kid. It has been effective. When the doors just open right up and the kids are gone, the kids just blast right out the door, and then the staff is chasing them while trying to call 911 all at the same time. Can be chaotic.
I know the incidents where I'm seeing kids that have run from some of these programs, they're waiting until they're outside playing basketball or doing something along those lines, and then they're waiting for
That's
the
a good
staff to
point.
turn their backs. I know the last few kids who have, within the last year who ran, they were very calculated. Like, it was not, the runs were not based on impulsivity. Some of them were very well mapped out as to waiting for the opportunity to present, to be able to leave. And it wasn't without use of violence. Like, they were just waiting for like staff to not be looking at them. And some may have intentionally like overthrown balls or did things to like distract in order to effectuate just giving them that 30-second window to like hop over like the fence or wherever it was to be able to run. So.
Renee, gonna come over to you and then Michelle. And if you could introduce yourself, Renee.
Sure. Hi, I'm Renee Marquardt with the Colorado Department of Human Services. I'm also a child psychiatrist by background. And I've spent time working with kids in residential centers and hospital settings, and et cetera. My question is about this higher end mental health kids and how you serve them in Vermont. And I haven't heard you talk about your centers as PRTFs or QRTPs, and I know not all states have adopted those designations. I'm wondering if you can say anything about kind of the breakdown of the levels of care at the centers that you have, and also what proportion of kids do you have in out-of-state facilities because their needs can't be met at the facilities you have?
Sure, I can talk to the questions about Family First Prevention Services Act and QRTPs. You know, all of the 50 states were required to take a look at this and try to get it up and running. And some states were first and some states were somewhere in the middle. And I guess there's going to have to be a state who's last to get it all done, the 50th state. I think that might be Vermont. I'm not sure why it's taking so long, but we are really slowly moving through all of the requirements of FFPSA. And we have not designated a single facility in Vermont as a QRTP yet. So we're losing federal funding because of that. And that's currently where it stands. I know there are people within our system working on that, but we don't have a single facility designated as a QRTP here in Vermont.
Or PRTF, then I assume.
We don't have a PRTF in Vermont, but there is talk of the building of one soon. Interestingly, we attempted to designate Woodside, our lock facility, as a PRTF, and that kind of flew for a little while, but then ultimately it was determined that we could not consider that a PRTF because it was locked.
So we actually do plan on building a PRTF. There is a bidder. It was just a testimony was given at the Vermont legislature last week where the department spoke that there has been a proposal put out for a PRTF and an effective bidder. And so that is going to be in the process of being built and created, however long that takes to actually happen. So eventually we will have a PRTF. I'm not sure the timelines as to when they're hoping for that to come online here.
And Renee, you're in your question about, in answer to your question about the sort of different levels of the facilities that we have, there are no sort of stratified designations for different facilities. Every facility that we have is licensed as an RTP, a residential treatment program. There's no levels to that or anything like that. Having said that, they're totally all over the map in terms of their levels of supervision and like the sort of containedness of the building or the control that they, try to have. Some programs look like houses, and kids are sort of free to have jobs and go to a typical high school and, go visit family on the weekends and stuff like, have friends come over. It's residential light, and then there's a continuum or a spectrum of care that went previously all the way up to our secure facility, which was, sort of opposite end of the continuum. At this point, now that our secure facility is closed and we haven't built a new one yet, I would say that these staff secure buildings that we have, residential treatment programs with delayed locks, are our highest level of care in state right now. But none of them have different designations. They're all licensed as the same thing and are a licensed RTP in Vermont. And the answer to the question about kids in state and out of state, we had always for many, many years had, far fewer kids out of state than in state. But just a couple of years ago, and this is likely a result of the closure of Woodside, the ratio crept up to the point where it was about 50-50. We had 50% of our kids that are in residential in Vermont residentials, 50% of our kids in residential and out-of-state residentials. And I heard from our director of the SSU recently that has now flip-flopped, and we now have a higher percentage of kids out of state than in state, which is problematic for a million reasons. And it's not something that we have strive for. It's just the nature of our lack of, a full system of care in Vermont right now.
To piggyback on that, with regards to the kids who are served by the Department of Mental Health and Dale and Agency of Education, because all of those requests come through me for out-of-state placements through ICPC, there is a good number of requests. So I would say there's at least a few a month who are being that we're sending out of state for private residentials. With those are the kids who are not involved with DCF. What I can tell you is that in hearing from some of these agencies, that the profile of kids that all agencies are seeing is a lot more complicated and complex. And so our community-based services are not equipped at this point to manage kids with maybe like developmental needs and mental health needs, developmental trauma, and then you add in the aggression piece, kids who are violent, that our community, that threshold seems to, and then we have no residential treatment programs for substance abuse residential treatment programs in the state of Vermont. So any youth or child who needs residential treatment for substance abuse, they have to go out of state. So there's just there's very limited intensive outpatient treatment for substance abuse either within the community for our adolescent population. So we have a higher number of kids going out of state, even who aren't part of our department, due to the community not being able to meet their complicated and complex needs.
Thank you. And then a quick follow-up on that, just to make sure I understand the population who's out of state, because since you don't have a secure setting for even the sort of juvenile justice side for kids who don't have any other need other than public safety for being in a setting, are most of the kids who are out of state, is it for public safety reasons and criminal justice, or is it mostly kids who need treatment services, like residential treatment?
I would say the majority is for kids who need treatment services. And I would argue that most of the kids who are involved in juvenile justice, it's a blessing and a curse to have juvenile justice and child protection all under one agency. But I would say that most of them have experienced adverse childhood experiences and have trauma, which tends to be the root of a lot of things. There are some pocket of kids who are conduct disorder, who that needs to be the focus of their treatment. But I would say the majority of the kids, that is just one part of the puzzle for them.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. But you're not needing to send them out of state simply because you don't have a secure corrections.
There are some kids that we are absolutely struggling with who are delinquent that we are trying to send out of state. And to be perfectly transparent, we have some kids who need to be in a locked facility, and there's no program in the United States that will take them due to their level of violence and aggression and treatment needs. And so we are trying to be as creative as we can in what we're doing, but a lot of them end up going back into the community because of our lack of resources in the state of Vermont and frankly, in the whole country. Our specialized services unit has a team member that her job exclusively is to find programs to meet the needs of kids if we don't have a contract with a program that can serve that need. And so she'll go out, she'll find programs, she will go and visit them, she'll vet them. And if she check their regulatory history, and if it's a program that she thinks that would meet the needs of that child, then we'll work on developing a contract with them so that we can use them. So we are, as a state, struggling with some of those delinquent youth who are extremely violent. Girls specifically, girls who are violent are really hard to place. So there's just limited options.
Thanks for all the detail.
Yeah, thanks, y'all. And I'm looking at the time. We've got about, I know, Chris, we have 15 minutes left with you. Tristy, do you have a hard stop at 9:30 our time?
I do not have a hard stop.
Okay. All right. We might keep going with you if there's still questions. But Michelle, I want to come over to you, and then Brandon.
Hi, thanks. So I'm Michelle Bradley. I supervise an ongoing adolescent unit in Douglas County. And so I deal with like all the running. And so I guess my question, and it kind of leans over into what we were just talking about. So we have a kid in a QRTP, right? And they run and they go back to the facility. They might be there a day, a week, and they run again. And then we put them back at that facility. And then sometimes it's really, and sometimes the facility is like, we're done, right? Like, here's a 30-day notice. Sometimes we're not even given a 30-day notice. It's just to come pick up this kid. So then this kid who has now been labeled a chronic runner has an unsuccessful discharge. And then so trying to find another placement that will take them in the very limited number of placements that we have in Colorado is becoming really, really hard. And then we have to exhaust all the in-state options before we look out of state. And an example I have right now is we have a girl who is 12. Nobody in Colorado will take her. We're looking out of state. We have one yes that is a wait list of a year. So just like, I guess, how does Vermont handle those chronic kids who are running? Do you guys have like a 3 times in your out policy? Like, how are you guys managing like those kind of things?
In the residential programs?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's built into the contracts with some of the out-of-state programs, but like we had a youth who we sent out to a residential program in Arizona, and she lasted a week and a half before we kindly were asked to take her back. And you know, she ran once, she did a lot of other things while she was there too that earned her like I think it's it's really difficult with programs. I know in my interstate world, I only get pulled in to like pull kids back or get issued like to make sure states are responding if the other state is not actively making plans to like get the kids back. Like, I think running is part of the treatment work that has to get done. But they have to like stay and be there in order to do it. I know for us, like if they keep on running from programs, then we're likely going to start looking for like a PRTF program for them that is a locked psychiatric treatment program is generally what if they're unable to do the treatment work in a residential treatment program that's not locked, then we're going to be upping our levels of what we're looking at.
Yeah, because we don't have anything locked here either, other than detention.
Yeah, no, we're not locked. We don't either. So we're looking out of state. So we have contracts with PRTF programs in other states across the country, mostly within the mostly on the East Coast, that we have contracts with PRTFs.
I was just going to say that I'm conflicted about the fact that we had our secure facility and it was problematic and it needed to close and eventually did close. However, our hands are tied now in terms of some of the kids that we're needing to place because of their needs. And there's a concept that was sort of summarized by the phrase "no eject, no reject." And the idea is, this program is a no eject, no reject program. This was our secure facility in Vermont. It was run by the state of Vermont, and no eject, no reject meant didn't matter how many times the kid had run away from somewhere, like this program had to take them if they were referred there. No eject meant, doesn't matter what the kid did when they were in the program, you can't kick them out. This is how the program is set up. We don't have anything like that in Vermont now that would be considered no eject, no reject. That's something that really can only be done, as far as I can tell, when it's run by the state, because a private agency at a certain point is going to say, this is too much for us, we can't do this. So that sort of like demand that the program take everybody and never kick anybody out, it was in some ways it was great, because we didn't have those placement crises where couldn't find anybody to take the child. Sorry, I interrupted you, Trace.
No, don't be sorry. Well, I'm actually interested, when you had that locked facility, was there a waiting list? So you said, you just said that
No eject, no reject meant no waiting list. Take
So
whoever
it was
we
a 30
refer to.
bed. It was a 30 bed facility that I think I don't think we ever, I don't remember a time, I've been with the department for almost 21 years, where it was like full. So
No,
I remember
a
like
license for 30, and it would typically have 5 to 10 kids in it.
yeah, I'm just thinking about situations we hear of in Colorado where it's like, we've got kids in, waiting rooms in the hospital and all these sorts
Well,
of
that's
things.
what we have in Vermont now, that we don't have a locked, secure facility. That's exactly what we have in Vermont right now.
Yeah.
So I can tell you what we're doing, in the lack of locked and lack of facilities is not ideal. It's pretty unsafe for all parties involved, but we are staffing kids at a variety of locations with our staff, sometimes with law enforcement, at hospitals, police stations, in their lobbies. Police department, one of the police departments has a room in their basement that they loan us. And then
It's a finished basement.
It is a finished basement, yes. And then a couple of buildings that we are able to use that are through some programs, and one that's through our sheriff's department. And so, but we have to provide the staffing with our staff. And we have, on average, in the last few weeks, that we're staffing 5 different kids in 5 different locations, with our staff rotating 24 hours a day, which is not sustainable and extremely problematic. So for some of these kids who really do need a higher level of care. And I will say, in those situations, like, I'm one of the people who staff, I am not going to be restraining a kid. I'm not trained to do that anymore, unless they're little. The youngest kid that I've staffed is 10. But generally speaking, if there is a youth that we're staffing and they're threatening to run, like, we're going to be letting them run and calling the police for the police to intervene to get them, because that would compromise our staff's safety. And that somebody could get hurt in those moments. So.
Michelle, did you have a follow-up before I jump in?
No, I was just gonna say that, I'm hearing other counties, thankfully we haven't had to do it. I mean, their caseworkers are spending the night in hotels with kids, which is completely wildly unsafe. So
That's what they're doing down in Pueblo.
Yep.
The only location we don't do, because we had an unfortunate incident a few years ago where a staff was sexually assaulted by a youth during a staffing incident. And so that is the one location that we generally don't do anymore in terms of where we staff kids, is at hotels.
Appreciate you sharing that. I just had one quick follow-up, and then Brandon and Renee, and I also, Stephanie, I see your request in the chat too. So I want to make sure we get to that around the hard infrastructure piece. It just sounded like, Chris, you mentioned earlier that policies and responded to the kids. So in the case that you are potentially contracting with an out of state because you don't have a locked facility now in Vermont, is there any hard and fast policy around when you would engage with that around a certain kid's situation, or is that, again, a case by case basis?
Yeah, all of those things end up being case by case. There's nothing, specific in policy.
Okay.
I just cut out for me, Trace. Did you say like for kids in state or out of state, or were you talking about both?
When you were talking about sending a kid state potentially because they had run so many times that you felt like your hands were tied, I was just wondering if there was a specific policy around when you would engage around that out of state conversation, or if that was a case by case. I just wanted to make sure we weren't making an assumption of like how you were getting to that kind of tip over point.
So the case review committee is going to be the group that decides what, like, which program is going to best be matched for that child, whether that be in state or out of state. And so if we get a notice from, let's say, a Vermont residential program that their needs are too high, they're running away, or they're engaging in too much like suicidal ideation or self-harming, or, you know, a variety of reasons of why we get notices to, like, from programs saying like this isn't working out anymore. Those cases have to get re-referred back to the case review committee, and then the case review committee then makes the determination as to, like, what's the next set of programs that we're going to be looking at, wherever they may be, and whether or not we should be looking at a PRTF program. So it's the case workers who are assigned to the cases. They don't get to make those decisions as to which programs get sought out and looked at. The case review committee is the one that makes those determinations.
Got it. All right, thanks for that. Brandon, go ahead.
Yeah, so Chris, you mentioned a little bit ago that you were looking at the PRTF for that secure place, but you guys stopped because it was locked. Is there a prevention, like something that hindered a PRTF from being locked in your state, or is there a reason that wasn't pursued further?
I could be wrong about this, but my understanding was that in order to be qualified as a PRTF, it can't be a locked facility.
Well, I think most PRTFs are locked facilities. I think there were other determinations as to what went into why Woodside would not qualify as a PRTF. So I think there was a discussion at that time.
Oh.
And I don't want to, like, go down that rabbit hole because I don't think that's what you guys are hoping for. But there was a question of, like, is this detention or is this treatment? And, like, what are the elements that you need in order to qualify for treatment versus detention? And so, like, the program that Chris was talking about that we were trying to get vetted as a PRTF didn't qualify was generally, like, I think towards the end before it closed, like, it was just detention, juvenile detention. But I will say there was a period of time when it was up and running that it had an incredible treatment program as part of it, that they did really good treatment work with that population, but it was not designated as a PRTF program.
Thank you for saying that. I misspoke when I said it couldn't be a PRTF because it was locked.
Yeah, and just to jump.
Okay, so you're.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Brendan.
I was just saying, your experience is that most PRTFs you're dealing with out of state are secure and locked.
Yes, PRTFs are locked psychiatric treatment programs.
Yeah, Tracy, thanks for clarifying that. I misspoke when I said that the reason Woodside couldn't be a PRTF then is because the kids were adjudicated and required to be there by law. Is that why it wouldn't have counted?
I wasn't part of those conversations, so I just know very summary version that there was a difference because as to whether or not they could be considered a treatment program or if they were going to be considered detention.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That was foolish of me. Of course, a PRTF has to be locked. That's right.
Yeah, actually, can I jump in there, because our department has done a fair amount of research on this. So in PRTFs, just to clarify, don't have to be locked. You know, we have,
Oh, they don't. Okay.
We have PRTFs in Colorado, and we don't have anything locked in Colorado. And okay. Yeah, what you were saying is, and they can be locked. There's nothing prohibiting it federally, but it is the issue that you talked about. Like, it can't be used then for a secure setting for kids who need the security for, like, the public safety reasons.
Okay.
For kids who need it for the mental health reasons.
Thank you.
That sounds like that might have been what caught you up in Vermont.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I have to run to an 11:30 meeting. This is really fun to do and a pleasure and important because of the gravity of the situation. And before I leave, if it's okay, I will wax philosophical for a second and say something that I think about all the time is, like, I spent a lot of time in Florida when I was a kid, and here in Vermont or in New England, we think about, you know, our birds, New England birds that fly south for the winter. And when I was down in Florida, it was down in Florida, the Floridians would say, these are our birds that fly north for the summer. Same birds. And I was just thinking about we're talking about running away, kids that run away, and from a preventative perspective, which is what this hopefully is all about. I think we see this is a very sort of provider-driven conversation, and we see it's like our kids who run away from us. But when you flip-flop it, they're running also to something. And I'm always trying to think about, from a preventative perspective, what is it that they're running to as opposed to what they're running away from? And sometimes they're running to something that's maladaptive and problematic and dangerous. And sometimes they're running to something which is family or connection or a lifelong connection of some sort. And I hope in Vermont that we can be better at trying to decipher what it is that the kids who are running away are actually running to, and try to get that into their life in some sort of healthy way so that they don't have to leave the program that we're trying to treat them in.
So just to add, piggyback onto Chris and Brian, I don't know if you can disseminate later on our policy regarding runaways, but one of the things that is a requirement for kids who are in DCF custody is that when they run away, within 7 days of their return from run, their worker or somebody who's connected to them from DCF is supposed to sit down and meet with them and do what's called a post-run interview. The only time that that's waived is if there's if as a result of their run, there was concerns for trafficking and there's an open investigation regarding the trafficking, then then that interview is going to take place through a forensic interview and the investigative process. But outside of that, kids are supposed to be interviewed to have a conversation about why they ran, because there's kids run for a reason. It might not be a good reason or any reason as to why, as an adult, you think is good enough for a kid to be taking off, but they always have one. And so we have to talk to kids in order to figure those things out and try to create plans. I know that's a lot of the work that I do in my consultations around trafficking for kids who are in the community, is looking at those areas of vulnerability and risk and creating plans with the youth to try to work on, what is it that's leading to their run? Because Chris is right, kids are running, they're either running to something or from something. And so there's reasons behind it. And sometimes they're impulsive decisions that are being made because they're upset and for a variety of reasons. And sometimes it's planned. And in my world, a lot of it is relationship based, and love is a motivating factor. And that connection and desire for acceptance and family, for whatever, those kinds of push-pull factors are extremely prominent for kids who run away a lot. And so it's really important that people are talking to kids, and that I'm not sure if in your residential programs or if your state part of state's 4E plans, I think, include that people are supposed to be talking to kids after they run away, but that's only directed to kids who are in foster care. And I do feel strongly that all kids should be talked to after they run away by somebody ideally that they're connected to, that they trust, to have a conversation about why they're running away, even when they're in a residential program. So that just my little plug there for in the prevention end of you've got to talk to kids to find out why they're running away, and then help work with them on developing a plan to help reduce that risk around future running. Because most kids are pretty smart and insightful, and generally are able to debrief and process to some extent around some of these things that they're doing. They might not understand the risk because they think they're invincible, which is right on target with that stage of adolescent development. But we have to keep on talking to them, even though they are hard and they are so not happy with us when they're being picked up. No teenager that's picked up from run is saying, "Thank you so much for picking me up and bringing me back." None of them are. So they're pretty pissed and have some colorful language to go along with it. But that still should be something that's considered and done for all kids who are running away from wherever it is that they're living.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Tristan. I think this group has a lot of interest and momentum around the youth voice piece. So I think as we eventually dive into that, it might be something to kind of come back to you all on of how are you doing that? How are you listening and creating opportunities for that collaboration and giving opportunity for youth to have voice there? All right, I'm going to stop us there. I think for the sake of time, we've got more to do. So Tristan, just want to say thank you so much. This is a super rich conversation, and really just appreciate your time and willingness to be here, all the way from the beach. So the beautiful Vermont beach. So certainly don't think this will be the last time you hear from us, and just appreciate the collaboration. So wanted to say thank you. And yeah, we'll hopefully talk to you more soon. Okay.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right. Take care. Thanks. All right, y'all. Great news. I do remember that we all need a break. So let's do this. Let's take 10 minutes, actually. I think that was a really rich conversation. I'm going to put together a quick note taker for you to do some reflections, both on that conversation, and then also in this next conversation too, so that we make sure that we're capturing the questions you have, the things that are coming up, the aha moments, etc. So this isn't just a conversation that then we forget about, but we will be returning to and making sure we kind of pull the right threads there. So let's come back at 9:45, and we will get rolling from there with the materials that we sent out. Thanks,
and please, if take this as an opportunity to take a glance at the materials if it's been a while since you've looked at them, but you can stick with the resources that we'll be discussing.
Yeah, Brian, I was going to say, don't look at the materials. Take 10 minutes. Get off the screen. You take whose advice
Fair.
you want. All right. Thanks, y'all. So here's what I'm going to suggest, Brian, before we get going on the materials, is I've got this note catcher. I just want folks to spend 5 minutes dumping in from this past conversation so that we don't lose. We capture the questions you had, but I know that those weren't all the questions you had or what's standing out. So I'm going to drop in this quick note catcher. And if folks could just take a couple minutes to generate what's sticking with you and what questions do you have or what do you want to follow up on? And let's not lose that. And then we'll kind of get into this next piece, Brian, with you, if that's okay. All right, drop that in. Super simple. We're just doing the top table. What stands out? So what's kind of like an aha? I mean, obviously one would be, for instance, now I'm forgetting the name, the stop piece, right? The delayed locks. That seemed to be something people were interested in, right? So just generating those sorts of things, what questions you have, what this brought up for you. And we'll take just a couple minutes. I'm going to give us some extra bullet points so that people aren't typing over each other. So give me 1 second. There we go. Folks just take different ones.
Hey, Trace, for some reason, it won't let me type in that thing.
Oh, won't. Okay. Well, Brandon, sorry. Well, why don't you voice it over real quick while everybody else is generating? I'm curious to hear from you.
Well, I think the pre-coordination is, an area that I think is, interesting. Identifying kids that, prior to placement that are kids are, need to be the stop out there in that communication and what that looks like. I think the delayed locks, we do that here. I'm not certain if they're doing it for every single door they have or like what are they, I guess more what that looks like around there. And then obviously the secure aspect of things, I think is like the secure setting and not having that now versus having that before and how that impacts on their system is another area.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this kind of brought up for me that it'd be really interesting to talk to like you there. Be like, okay, in practice, right? Like we hear from the policy side. And I feel like on the practice side, we're always like, but what does it actually look
Well,
like?
I mean, I think they seems like they struggle with the same things we struggle with. I think um, when do you do it? When do you not do it? So I think it's but I did find it interesting that the person that is doing the out of state saying that most of the PRTFs are secure that she deals with.
Yeah. All right, appreciate that, Brandon. I'll make sure we add these in. Let's say it looks like there's quite a bit in here. If you are finished kind of generating yours, would just encourage you to kind of read through what other folks are thinking before I pivot us. I think it's an interesting.
I was in a meeting recently where CDHS listed the top 10 facilities out of state where we are sending kids, and they are in Texas, Tennessee, and one other red state. I forget which one it was. My question is, I would like to know if those are all locked facilities or majority locked facilities. That's something we can look into. I can dig up that list too of the 10 facilities.
Becky, I was going to ask a question too, just about when you said Tennessee, there's I think it's called Dogwood campus, I think is the right one, with youth villages. One of their facilities though has a ton of land, like a ton of land. And so their whole point is, sure, let the kid run. They're not going to make it off the land. And I don't know if there's a fence, but I would be curious if we could ever get really creative and build facilities with a ton of land so kids can sprint and then, run out of breath. So just a potential thought.
That's a good question.
Sounds like a scene out of Holes, right? Maybe Holes, where it was like, just go.
That was
Yeah.
essentially what the Ridgeview Center that was operated by Rites of Passage was that CDHS had for kids in the juvenile justice system. It didn't have a secure perimeter, but it just like that, it was kind of in the middle of nowhere. So kids would have to really think hard about trying to run. And then once they did, it was easier to pick them up because there was just open land. Definitely is one way to do it.
Yeah. I'm seeing a note here that I was actually kind of curious because I don't know this. And so I'm curious y'all's interest in this or if this feels accurate for Colorado. But someone's making a comment about the small programs piece. So that number sounded small. Curious how that relates to Colorado. And somebody made a comment about that. So I don't know if that's Brandon, if you have a comment or somebody else pinged that, or yeah, maybe Becky, was that you?
Yeah, I did make a comment about that because with the rates that I don't mean for it to always go back to rates for providers, but with the rates we're getting, there's no way with the economies of scale that we could afford to we could fund a program with 8 or 10 kids in it. I mean, we're not there. And so if it's funded differently, that's probably possible. I don't know if that's what Brandon was going to weigh in on or not.
Yeah, no, I was going to say the same thing. I think that would come down to the business model approach that the state would have around it. But I mean, smaller is always better if you can make it work. But it's a matter of can you resources and financially make it work.
Yeah, can I ask a question actually around that? Because I'm curious for a small program. So I'm thinking of like putting my education hat on. People say that like small schools are good for kids, right? Because they feel seen and known. And that also like comes with like less opportunities for that child, less, resources, et cetera, because of the funding mechanism. So in the small facilities, well, are there small facilities in Colorado that are working? Or is it just, we just don't do small facilities at that level?
Not really. Not that I know of anyway.
Are you talking about QRTP or PRTF or because there's
kind of anything as far as their examples of what they were talking about. So yeah.
Not quite as small. I mean, it definitely is the direction that the mental health world wants to be going in. That smaller, more home-like, less institutional. But and I think the funding piece is really the crux of it, and that's where a lot of conversations are right now. Is how do you properly fund to be able to do what we want them to do?
What, Stephanie?
Great. Yeah, a couple synchronicities here, and I just wanted to connect Renee and Brian together a little bit because Renee, I know that you said in our last session, and I think alluded to it a little bit today, that the State Department, CDHS, is working, convening discussions regarding PRVTs, how those could be made more physically secure. I reached out at your advice, Renee, to CDHS lobbyists. She couldn't meet for a bit, but I would like to combine these conversations a little bit, at least so that we understand as a task force what the state is doing. And my understanding is it's with PVRTs, not these other QRTPs, or I don't know, but I just want to make sure that as we talk about these issues, we can limit the scope of our analysis if the state is having a conversation in part about the same thing we are. Now, I don't think they're completely duplicative, but I just want to make those two things join together. And then secondly, Brandon, are you saying that you have delayed locks on your facility, but those are not present in other facilities in the state? Am I catching you right?
Yeah, we have delayed locks on certain doors.
Okay.
My understanding, I'm not 100% correct, or I'm certain I'm correct on this, when we couldn't apply them to every door. We could only apply them to certain doors. And I don't know if that came with the fire code or the state, but we only have them so each of our housing units are set up where there's two access points out, and the one door can have the delayed and the other door isn't able to have the delayed for whatever reason. I'm not 100% certain why. And to be honest, I feel kind of foolish that I haven't looked into that more further, but which I'm going to now that it's kind of on my radar. But yeah, our front door does not have a delayed egress.
Great. And yeah, Brian, I'd love for us to follow up on that just again, so we're understanding the nuances of these different mechanisms, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, I agree with that stuff because I was looking through that material that we have for them, and it's just pretty high level. So I think some of those policies, procedures on that kind of hard structuring piece would be helpful.
Yeah, and then just to follow up, I'm sorry, I keep pointing out individual members, but I know all of you are engaged in these activities. Becky, I would love to know, just because you're involved at this national level, what is that hard infrastructure that facilities nationally are using, short of locked, purely locked doors? Elizabeth, you brought up a point a while ago, which I thought was really good, about, what about electronic monitoring in certain circumstances, right? Like if we can't ask people to build 12-foot fences, right? And I appreciate from a provider perspective, that isn't necessarily cost effective or possible, right? But you brought up electronic monitoring, people brought up delayed time doors. I just want to dig deeper into that because, again, I keep thinking it comes down to an immediate need and then the longer term needs. And frankly, I'm taking that language from Elizabeth and Kevin. I wasn't smart enough to think of it on my own. But I do think there's immediate needs that have me concerned still at night as we continue to talk, right? And then the longer term piece is about prevention planning and all that. So I would just love to figure that out, Becky, if you can assist.
Yes, I'm happy to assist with that, Stephanie. I'll put that question out.
Yeah, thanks. And Brent, again, just connecting you with now Brandon, Becky, and Renee. Just so I think the synergies there could be really useful.
Just real quick, just a point of order. My son cut off 3 ankle bracelets during his teenage years. So for certain kids, I think they'd be great. They were great for him at times, but other times they were ineffective and only got him in more trouble.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, right, Kevin, I mean, the truth of the matter is where there's a will, there's a way. And that's just true in any sort of policy context, right? I mean, there's always going to be those exceptions. But I think where I really do get so concerned is, when there's no protections. And I feel like that's where we stand right now.
Yeah, and I think I was probably referencing younger kids. I mean, Timmy was only 12, but I got the idea in their preschool ministry at church. One of the ladies I was serving with is an ABA therapist, and she had a client that was 8 or 10 years old, whose mother was putting a tracking device like in his underwear every day. So that would probably apply to smaller or younger children.
That's helpful. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Yeah, thanks, y'all. This is there's so much to make sure that we're capturing. And so again, I'm excited that we're able to kind of get into this level, and we'll continue to do this in the subcommittee work. So I don't want y'all to feel like this is the only conversation. We'll continue these conversations. I do want to pause us right now as far as kind of our reflections and connections we're making there, just because Brian did a lot of work around information gathering. And so Brian, I was going to drop back in the Google Drive. These are the same files that were sent to you via email, but if it's handier to access them here. And so Brian, would love for you to just kind of voice over what folks have, and then let's give them some time with it too. So again, we're kind of flipping our hats a little bit more to like what's actually true in Colorado, and what questions do we have, and what's in front of us. So I'll stop there. Brian, hand it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So based on the conversation that we had in the first meeting of this subcommittee, we picked up that the group was very interested in not only learning what other states have been doing and understanding what's in policy there in terms of prevention, but then also having a more firm grasp on what Colorado statute and regulations actually say. So I prepared 2 documents for us. If you happen to have the Google Drive up right now, you can take a look, but there's this Colorado statutes regulations document. That's an 80-pager that we don't expect you to read through and memorize, but it compiles several different pieces of statute and regulation that are relevant to our conversations. On page 2, there's just a table of contents that kind of says what portions are included and gives a very brief summary of them. And then the actual literal text is given in the remaining 78 pages. So that can just be a common resource for us to have together to help us process and understand what this statute and regs actually say. And we can just have that as a continuing conversation in subsequent meetings that we have, because I know, the concern about like, what does the law actually say? What is the folklore around what people think that it says? What are differences in interpretation? Brandon, do you have a question?
Yeah, sorry. So I read through those yesterday, and for you, question, like, I guess there were several different statutes, long laundry list of statutes, and my confusion on it was, and some are like a little contradictory, at least the way I interpreted it. Like, what are applicable to us? Because like even when you got down to the regulations, like for example, one of what is considered a restraint as far as time wise, and I think it says a minute in there for the statute. Anything under a minute is not considered a restraint. But then the regulations obviously say anytime you go hands on, that is a restraint. But then you get into other statutes like that kind of contradicted the other statute of like what's considered an emergency, and they get more descriptive. So I don't know where the regs are getting pulled from, interpreted from those statutes to make the regulations, I guess was my question, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Yeah, it is important to note, as we had put on the first page, just that these do apply to different circumstances in different situations. So like, for instance, mental health care is one chunk of the statutes provided. So these aren't necessarily always applicative to the exact youth that we are talking about, but having that reference to be able to resource can be helpful. And not every piece is directly applicable to the folks we're thinking about, but it can be useful to have that in mind when thinking about how the whole legal environment works for it. And the Ombuds Office is working on thinking about possibly getting a presenter who can speak to more of the nuance of the specifics of the statute and regulation. But I figured that it was a good starting point just to give everyone this document that lets us have the same language in common, so that we can be referencing specific citations when grappling with the law's provisions. Stephanie, you have something to add?
Yeah, I would just say, Brandon, I mean, you're accurate. The reality is those 80 pages do encompass different circumstances. So there's restraint and seclusions in the cases we're talking about. There's a restraint and seclusion definition and policy for kids in the Division of Youth Services who are adjudicated. There's a definition and process for restraint and seclusion for those who are held pursuant to the Behavioral Health Act. Right. And so, yes, I actually, you're going to laugh because I'm a total geek, but I actually went through and I photocopied all the pages and put bright yellow tabs so I would not get confused as I was reading through the regs and the laws and trying to match them up. But because I was struggling, Brandon, I did ask our team to, let's figure out how we can do a presentation that's very clear to our circumstances in this instance. And while we know this other stuff lists out here, and we may want to use that as supporting language, like maybe we want to change our laws in our state. Right. And maybe we want them to incorporate some of the principles in the DYS space or behavioral health space. But that's kind of the big view. And then we're hoping to hone in at sort of the 3,000-foot view.
Well, Stephanie, do you know when they build volume 7 and the volumes, which statutes they pull from, or do they just say, I like this part and that part, or what? Like, how does that build? Do you know that? Like, that was what was coming to my mind. Like, how did they pull that and build the volume 7 regulations that we are governing us?
Yeah, so what they do is they take laws that have been passed in statute, and then they form rules committees for operational use is probably the best way for me to frame it. So, your statute is pretty broad, right? It'll say something like, you can't restrain and seclude children in a certain circumstance. And then the rules go deeper and say, well, what is the definition of certain circumstances, right? Right. And then it lays out the detail or the meat.
Okay.
So they should be correlating, right? In theory. Yeah. I say in theory because I will also tell you I've read many laws, and I'm looking at Ashley Chase right now. I've read many laws and seen what we did in rules, and I'm like, whoa, where did you come up with that? And the truth of the matter is rules only have to pass the state board. So the truth is you don't necessarily have someone who's really deep analyzing whether the statute meets the exact reg or rule that's being promulgated. So if you see things that don't feel congruent, that would not surprise me.
Okay, yeah, that was what was coming to my mind, like knowing the regulations and then reading those things. Like, I'm like, did they look at this one statute? Because this completely contradicts what the reg. So I was just wondering how they selectively picked it.
Yeah, and I also have found in my experience, and I don't love this, but many people will say, Stephanie, we'll do the law vaguely and we'll figure out all the rest in rules. I can't tell you how many people have said that to me, and I'm like, but rules aren't law, and I'm not comfortable with that. If you want it to be a law, it needs to be a law. We don't then kind of run free with our own interpretation of the law. We are not judges. We shouldn't be doing that, but trust me, it happens all the time. That's my cynical self. Sorry. You got the cynical lawyer, Stephanie, on that.
So we can certainly, and we definitely will be talking more about the nuances in Colorado law, but just for the sake of previewing the resources on that Google Drive, the other one I'll direct your attention to is called State Policy Research Prevention Subcommittee. So that gives a sort of a one-page summary of some state policies I found in other states that might be of interest to the folks here, including Vermont. So it includes Kansas, Vermont, Wyoming, and Texas. You can take a look at those just sort of one-pager resources I put together that summarize at the top what the regs say, and then give the exact language from the regs. I just bolded some key phrases to help with scanning. But looking at Kansas, Vermont, and Wyoming are all similar in their use of, or the reason why they were captured were their provisions regarding locked facilities and limited use of seclusion and restraint. And then Texas is on there because it has provisions. It recently enacted law requiring education and training on runaway prevention methods for each foster parent, prospective adoptive parent, and relative or other designated caregiver. And then there are some links there. You can actually click through the actual both trauma-informed training and the runaway prevention training. So those are just there for your consideration. And, if any of these are really exciting to task force members, I could reach out to try to find folks who can speak more to them, or present a 201 level analysis of these states. But yeah, just those are the resources we provided. So kind of a baseline understanding and shared document regarding Colorado statutes and regulations, and then this overview of what 4 other states have done in this space.
So want to give you time with those materials, Brian. I'm curious if we want to start. I mean, I know the other page is the 80 page document. So you're asking folks to kind of review just the kind of table of contents, generally that second page, the kind of overviews in general. And then I think the next thing is to go really into this document where you've kind of compiled some different states to see if there's continued kind of momentum around additional things you want to hear about. Is that right?
Yeah, and just kind of food for thought considerations of what's happening in other states. You know, is this something that Colorado would want to pursue? Just I think the general idea here being that Colorado doesn't need to reinvent the wheel, and can adopt ideas from other states. So however it strikes your fancy reading what's happening in these other states, just let us know. And this is a forum to discuss how those can be helpful to you.
Yeah, so let's do this. I want to give you all some time with this. I also added, I think the note catcher is really helpful for us as just a way for you to capture your thoughts. So I put another table down below, and I'll add some additional bullets again. As you go through these materials, particularly the state analysis one, and then just kind of looking at the Colorado overall, capturing those questions for us, I think will be really helpful. So it's at the bottom of that same note catcher page, which I'm going to drop back into the chat. So again, you've got the Google Drive, which has the documents, and then you've got the note catcher. And so as you're going through those documents, at the bottom of the note catcher, what stands out, what's missing, and questions and wonders you have, just as as you're reviewing, so that you're not forgetting kind of things you're thinking about. And then we can continue the conversation. So I'm going to say 15 minutes for folks to dive in. Brandon, it sounds like you already did your homework, which I love. So if you have the opportunity to throw in some of those notes and those questions, this would be a great spot to do that. So we'll come back at, thanks, Becky, appreciate it. We'll come back on camera at 10:25. If folks are done before then, just come off camera and let me know at 10:25. Thanks, y'all.
Hey, Brandon, I'm super curious about, I know that your facilities do intake, right, on youth who come in, and you probably identify run behavior. But is the difference with Vermont that they do it in coordination with the person regulating to try to assess, like, in advance what those risk factors are? So the discussion maybe happens up front versus at the back end when a kid runs.
Yeah, it sounds like to me, reading between the lines, like if they take on a kid that's a high risk runner, that the agency will reach out to their monitor or licensing person and they coordinate. Are you okay with us stopping this kid and not getting cited for it? And I think that's what it sounds like to me they're doing around this stuff.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I was hearing it right, because I did like that idea, Brandon, right? Just so that we could, especially facility to regulator relationship, right? Because you and I both know that those relationships change constantly, right? And what one regulator does in one facility, they don't do in a different facility. And so at a minimum, trying to establish a relationship, right, with the person who is in charge of your region or your facility, I think could be a useful procedure. I was just curious about your thoughts.
Yeah, and I do like, I think they had, it sounds like they had some assessment tools they're using too, to kind of bring everybody together on the same agreement level of like risk. At least in the human trafficking side of things, I think there's some, I'm not sure if they have things on the, like the angry, like, emotional, like the trauma response stuff. But I think the more we can get agreed upon risk factors on kids, I think would be a better approach.
Yeah, I agree with you, Brandon. That brought a little more clarity to me about how to get through this legal interpretation that everybody wrangles with, right? And I think that was probably one of my bigger takeaways from what they had to say.
Yep.
Jump in, Renee. Go ahead.
Yeah, just on that same topic, it would be great to get some clarification or added detail on that, because it feels like the conversation got a little mushy, at least in my head as it went on, but I thought I heard them talking about kind of two distinct layers that not only is restraining someone allowed, and they said even encouraged if it's a safety issue, which they described some scenarios that would be, but there's then this predetermined stop order, like you guys were just discussing, where they have that evaluation. And I'm curious what added thing that allows. It was an interesting concept. If you know that someone might be at risk, and he even described as someone with a known, opiate use history who might overdose. And if you knew they might be leaving to use, you could restrain them, it sounds like, without that stop order. So I'm curious what added allowances having that stop order actually does, what the distinction is there.
Renee, I'm guessing it's very similar to the stuff that we probably like think about all the time with the kids that are placed that are, I'm guessing they use drugs, consistent runaways, age, the same risk factors that we probably all talk about all the time. So
yeah, I agree with that. Sorry, I wasn't being clear. What I was meaning is I'm wondering what added things it allows the staff to do, like how much sooner can they jump in? What categories can they? That they can't, just based on the other regulations, which they, again, they said they actually encourage. They use restraint for safety. So I'm curious, like what added allowance it gives the staff for restraint.
Like what it actually looks like in practice. Like, does it mean when you just take step foot off the grounds, like you immediately, like, yeah, I agree. That was all going through my head as well.
And is it like it is informed by the way?
Yeah.
So it sounded like, if I got this right, that Vermont has a state person who's looking at the characteristics of the kid and finding the right facility to them. And my question is, do we have anything like that in Colorado? Having been through it many, many times, I never saw anything like that here.
Kevin, we do. They have the placement agencies. The problem is, I think, with our state is because it's decentralized that they don't really, like, it sounds like they have a state referral system that drives everything, where it's more county based here. So I don't think it's effective, but we do the placement, like the state has placement agencies. Like I get calls from all the time, referrals and things of that nature.
Okay.
And so maybe, is it the distinction then, Brandon, you're actually, well, one, I think it would be helpful to know if there is a tool, right? I mean, I know we have the human trafficking tools. So my guess is some of these things all fall within that, right? But it's deeper than even that. So one, maybe the distinction for us is that, do we have an agreed upon tool, set of risk factors? And secondly, assessing that in combination with the state ahead of time, right? And also then involving, I think, parents in these decisions, right? And the other members who were impactful. And Kevin and Elizabeth, part of what struck me, right, is, the fact that parents have not had input, I think, generally speaking, on these matters. And what one parent wants, another may be like, no, but that shouldn't necessarily be dispositive, right? But it should be, I think, a consideration. Parents know their children. So I don't know, maybe I'm trying to figure out what I gleaned from this lecture today, right? This presentation. And I think if it were anything, it was just what we referenced about, I'll call it pre-admission tools. And then as I was looking at our reading materials, I'm super interested in Texas's runaway prevention curriculums for providers, staff, foster parents. So I don't know. I'm interested in what other people's sort of big takeaways were, because otherwise, I'll be honest, Vermont sounds like they're struggling as much as we are.
Yeah. One thing I'd add to that, Stephanie, too, like one thing that like kind of came through my mind when they were talking is like the need for us. They obviously have it too. Is like we have this supposed continuum of care, and the differentiation between what does it mean to place a kid in QRTP, what does it mean to place in PRTF? I mean, obviously, right there alone, between foster care and then, QRTP and PRTF, the differentiation between like risk factors there alone. And, when we have this system where we're supposed to be that continuity of care to handle the risk, the higher risk, it doesn't really, the rules don't really allow for that because they all look the same per se. You know what I mean? Like facilities look all the same, and I think that's part of the issue as well.
That's interesting.
I was just going to say, not so much exactly what they had talked about today, but just back to the kind of assessment piece. With those families that don't have Medicaid, there's pots of money, CYMHTA or FFPSA, and we have specific assessors that go out and they do these assessments with the kids and the parents, and we try and get 3 different points of view of people that have worked with this child. So say it's the psychiatrist, maybe it's a teacher and the therapist or something like that, and that's helping to determine where they're going. But I don't think I see that happening with the Medicaid population. But just in terms of like looking at, what level of care we're placing them in, those are pretty comprehensive. So I don't know if anybody's ever heard of those, or if that even kind of makes sense.
Isn't that kind of what CCHA does, though? They like pull information from the treatment providers before helping to direct a child to a level of care?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think they do some form of assessment, but these are, and again, I don't, like, we'll get referral packets, right? And so some of that information comes from the different rays for these kids. But just in terms of like a really comprehensive assessment, I mean, it takes several weeks. I'm not sure how long it takes to get all that information with rays doing it. So just a thought for levels of care.
Sure.
So I'm just curious, folks, kind of overall reactions to the helpful nature of this kind of like the information that you're receiving. I mean, Stephanie and Brandon, y'all just kind of alluded to, like, there's clearly no silver bullet in the systems that we're kind of elevating as the examples, right? Like, it's not that Vermont has this like, thing, something so rich and so deep that we're like, oh my gosh, like I'm not hearing a ton of ahas, but I'm curious, like, is this at least giving us the information we need to understand what other states are doing and kind of like where Colorado is at and where there are opportunities for innovation and for this group to be bold, but just want to hear where this kind of information and this content's landing for you all as like a working group.
I mean, I'll just say, I think that the thing that stood out was unfortunately just kind of at the very end when they talked about the why of the running. I mean, to me, that's the most prevention you can get at. Typically, because they will run it first, right? And so you're doing that assessment post-run to really figure out, okay, how can we prevent this from happening next time? I mean, obviously, I think everybody's interested in these stop orders and delayed locks, but to me, that's kind of the heart of preventing it from happening again, is figuring out the why. And I've shared with some of you guys, we partner with the University of Southern Florida and are working on a pilot with them for what we call a FAIR assessment. And it's a trauma-informed, in-depth interview on why kids run. So we do that with any of our kids in foster care after they run to figure out, okay, how can we prevent this and why are they running? Is there anything that we can do to help meet that need in a safer way? So that's kind of what I took from it, is like, we need more of that.
For what it's worth, I also prepped resources for the intervention subcommittee, and we had thought about this as, pre-run, post-run, but those aren't always, like, it can be cyclical. So in the documents for the other subcommittee, which you have access to on the Google Drive, that goes into like agreed responses across agencies once the kit is run. And for some of the states, it gets into details about things like the post-run interview or those sorts of procedures once the kid is recovered. So feel free to glance at those as well, because these groups are going to be in conversation with each other and have overlap. But that's definitely an area where a lot of states do have policy in place.
Appreciate you, Brian, making that kind of connection.
Yeah, Trace, I
Curious
guess
of-
just to answer your question, I appreciate the question, and I think that my comments are less about like the quality of this presentation, right? I thought, our presenters were very knowledgeable about their systems and were helpful. I think what I'm feeling is a frustration because I want someone to bring me that silver bullet, right? I want some state to go, here are our best practices. And we're like, hey, fantastic. We've just figured it out, at least 50% of the problem. And as we have researched this issue, I will tell you, continue to come up dry, which is a credit to all of those who are serving on the task force, because frankly, I think we're addressing issues that have been relatively unaddressed for decades, frankly. And so fantastic, we're on the cutting edge. Bad news, I don't think that there's somebody who's going to come give us the beautiful golden package and we're going to be like, that's the formula. So I think what I'm feeling is not so much a commentary about Vermont or the presentation, just that I feel like I'm trying to mine little tiny kernels from various articles, various states, and trying to figure out then how do we use that material to create something that's new or different or innovative for Colorado. So I think that's how I'm feeling about it right now.
Appreciate that, Stephanie. Renee, then Brandon.
Yeah, I was probably going to say something similar that, I think one of the benefits is just to see, are there any little even slivers that others are doing that might make sense to borrow? I think another benefit at looking at other states is to kind of see the bounds of what folks are doing, to know that if, the ideas that we might have in our state, like, is that going to really be sort of off the spectrum of what anyone else is doing? Where does that sit within it, just to kind of know, like, just like, I guess just that where it sits in the spectrum. I mean, I for the work of the department, I talked to a few states myself: Massachusetts, Kentucky, Ohio, California, and kind of a similar experience that, some are definitely doing different things. Might have like PRTFs, might have other things, might have creative ways, 2 levels of PRTFs or various things, but it's these kind of, the only real takeaways besides just understanding the spectrum of what's going on in other states is the little tiny nuggets here of things. So which can be useful, and even just seeing language, the way it's crafted in other states might be a slight variation from what we're doing and might be meaningful. I was also just going to say, to Jenna's point, I feel like this conversation is very based in kids who are in congregate, like center-based care, and which is a different, adds a whole different things on the potential menu for prevention and intervention that you wouldn't have, for example, in a foster home. I'm not going to talk about locked doors and tackling kids and things like that. And I think it is always important, I've made this point before, but of recognizing there's different categories of kids in a foster home that might be, really on the, understanding them relationship based might be the main avenue. And while that's important in residential settings and needs to be a part of it, then again, there's the other things like, should the fence be locked or not?
I appreciate that, Renee. Brandon, I'm going to come to you, and then we've got the other group coming back in 4 minutes, just FYI.
Yeah, so I agree with Jenna, and me personally, I think when you try to, I believe treatment should be individualized, and I think that's the pathway that it should be being driven. And every kid's going to be individually specific, and some do need that stop, and and some you need to have patience and allow and understand the why, and some is a trauma response. And I think like what I would like to see, my personal opinion is that, every kid is, when they're placed in these, placements are looking for, the people that know that kid the best, the professionals, the family. They're making a determination, what should happen when this kid's in crisis, and including runaways, and that decision's being made through the treatment plan. The problem is, right into the statute, it does say you cannot do it by the treatment plan, and I think that's where in my opinion, if that was lifted and it was individualized based, I think you would have less and less of these challenges, because the people that know the kid the best would be making the determination based on risk factors.
Hey, Brandon, where is that reference? I'm sorry, I feel very ignorant. I did not know that some of these considerations can't be discussed within a treatment plan.
It's in there in one of them. I can't tell you right off the top.
I'll go
but
back
it's
through my
in there.
80 pages. I obviously
it
did
says
not read well. Okay.
it cannot be
'cause-
guided by the treatment plan.
And it said, yeah, it can't be a part of a behavior modification plan, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
you're correct.
Well, that's an important thing we've taken away. Sorry, Elizabeth, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say that's part of that relationship between the people sending, coordinating care and deciding what placement, and the provider, is they're deciding ahead of time together that it's okay to stop this kid physically.
Thanks for those reflections. I'm gonna pick on someone. Ashley, I want to bring you in. I'm just curious from where you sit, like what's landing today. What are you like? Okay, yeah, where you at? Give some voice to us. I always appreciate your thoughts.
I think I'm just struggling as an attorney with like the lack of process and having kids in facilities that start to sound and look a lot like jail. When I read some of these regulations, some of the things that are allowed, or at least in my mind would be allowed under the regulations, are things that are prohibited in our detention facilities. So the idea that a youth in a civil system who has not committed a crime per se or something else would be subjected to more restrictions and restraint and things like that than somebody in a facility, just really I struggle with. So I think I've been trying to step back and read through things a few different times and get out of that mindset, because I do understand that sometimes there's a need to have some kind of interventions, but I'm just struggling with the youth side of this. And I know that we tend to always talk about the extreme example when that's not most of the kids in these facilities, and yet the decisions we're going to make will impact all of them. So I'm feeling a little heavy today and trying to figure out what those good lines are.
Appreciate you sharing that. Thanks, Ashley. All right, y'all. Well, there's so many things swirling in my head right now. There's so many things swirling in my head right now. I really appreciate everyone diving in here. I know there's a lot. I think we've got a lot to do to kind of synthesize back to this group what we're hearing and where we see momentum. The other group is coming in, so I just kind of want to close this out real quick and just share some gratitude for each of you. And also, Brian, really appreciate you putting all these resources together and trying to make sense of what folks are asking for. And so really look forward to, again, feedback from you all around what landed, what didn't, what do we need to dig in more on, and we'll continue the conversation from there. So I'm seeing some folks rejoining, so I'm going to do that, and we're going to do public comment. So I appreciate y'all staying on for that, just to hear folks, because we do have at least one request, and then we'll close out the meeting. Okay, let's. So I know I wish we had more time to kind of debrief, but I know folks were doing the work in their groups, so looking forward to kind of capturing that more in our meeting synthesis, and then we'll be sure to share that out, and we'll make sure we carve some time next time around so folks kind of can also voice over what they got into with their group. But I don't know about y'all, but prevention was rocking and rolling. So Doris, I'm assuming the same for your crew as well. All right, so we have 2 requests for public comment. Want to make sure we offer enough time for that. So I see Pam and Steve. Steve, let's start with you. You've got, would love to hear from you. Thanks for being here and appreciate your time. And I'll give you 3 minutes and let's go ahead.
All right, thank you. Just confirming everyone can hear me. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Great. I'm Steve Fisher. I'm not in the system. My day job is a civil engineer. I'm a board member of Federation of Families for Children's Mental Health, Colorado chapter. And the reason I'm interested in this group is because I've lived across the street from the Tennyson Center since 1995. So I've seen hundreds of runs and rescues. And I apologize, I wasn't, I think I chose the wrong group. So I don't know what the other subcommittee talked about, but as an observer of this group, there may be a misunderstanding about egress and conflating fencing as equal to lack of egress from buildings or a quote unquote lockdown facility. I did some investigating some months ago on building codes, egress, exit discharges, safe dispersal areas, and public ways. These are all code terms. I found a great article in a trade magazine, which I think I posted to the chat just a little while ago, if you're interested. And I also got a favorable response from City of Denver Zoning and Architectural Permit Review on the code interpretation regarding fencing around facility. I think because refusal to employ secure lot fencing has led to injuries and deaths to runaways. It's important to clarify that there is nothing wrong with secure lot fencing, neither for adults, minors, individuals in residential care, or facility schools. State licensing rules stipulate that local jurisdiction zoning and building codes are to be met. And the adopted building codes, meaning residential code, building code, fire code, allow secure lot fencing when criteria for buildings and lot configuration are met. It could result in a lot less restraint. Thanks for your time.
Thanks. And Steve, just to answer your quick question, is the two groups are intervention and prevention. So I believe you're on the intervention side, and so we had a group talking around prevention as well. So certainly next time, welcome you if you'd like to switch groups, or you're welcome to jump into either group next time. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, and if I can just jump in, Tree, Steve, that session is also recorded. So you don't have to miss anything at all. You just go to the website. I'm sure we'll post that either today or tomorrow. And you can, and I say that to all the committee members, it's probably would be very interesting to be able to see what was going on in that room as well. So I just want you to know it's available.
Thank you.
Excellent call. Appreciate it. Thanks, Stephanie, for that reminder. Yeah, Steve, we'll have those up ASAP for each group, which is why the reason we did the two different links, so that we could make sure that we had the right recordings. All right. Thank you, Steve. Appreciate that. Pam, would love for you to voice over. I know you dropped something in the chat, but only one group saw that. So welcome you to share with us.
Great. Thank you. Pam Trelaw, provider. This may be duplicative of what Becky or Brandon had shared in the group, because I walked into the middle of the movie. My apologies. But as we're talking about kind of where clients are and assessing and what do they need, just a reminder that that needs to be fluid and that needs to be timely, because as the clients enter treatment can look very different than 30 days into treatment, can look different right before discharge. And as kids and families are working through trauma or their issues, things could spike up. And I had heard one comment around, well, does a Ray do that? Yes, they could, but not everybody's always partnering immediately with a provider who has that direct responsibility of working with a child 24/7. So just to put that out, I'm sure we've got processes, but there's also practicalities and how things are really being implemented in Colorado in the here and now. And oftentimes outside of the provider working with the kiddo directly, other agencies coming in to do assessments or help are not timely and might not be accurate. So just putting that out there if we're looking at that. And then speaking on a broader term, I was in an interesting conference on Friday for over 6 hours through Lives in the Balance, Dr. Ross Green. And that was actually out of Maine, just miles away from the horrific shootings happened. So the timing was just horrific. But it was a conference on ending corporal punishment and ending seclusion and restraint. And I know that's a huge kind of end goal. And Stephanie, maybe I can send you the link because they just put the whole recording online. But talking about a lot of federal bills and a lot of talk, Canada and the US side, around movements to make sure restraints and seclusions are ended, right? So that's not going anywhere. Hopefully that will be the end goal, that we all as a system can work efficiently enough so kids might not need that. But then as a reminder, as Colorado's putting things together, maybe there needs to be a step system, right? Because we have to look at how we're currently functioning now with all the systems involved with the kids and the families' lives and how it integrates. And so maybe there's a first step where, you know, providers need to really work with the families and the kiddos and doing that emergency response plan, like Brandon was saying, which is in contradiction of maybe what the reg says, but the treatment plan needs to be fluid, updated all the time and right then and there. And then maybe long-term, as we have more time as a Colorado state system, getting better integrated practices, we could look at a larger end goal. Thank you.
Thanks, Pam. And as always, for both of y'all, we really appreciate both of your continued engagement here. So it means a lot that you continually show up and share your thoughts. So thank you. And thanks, Pam, for those specific pieces as well. We'll make sure that we capture those. All right, y'all, we are at time. We crammed it in today. I'm proud of us. I know there are, so thank you. And excited to kind of like see all the pieces come together. As Stephanie mentioned, we recorded both groups. So if you are curious or you want to dive into that, we will have those up just like we do regular meeting recordings. And then we'll also, of course, capture that in the meeting minutes for both groups and also the meeting synthesis as well. So with that, Stephanie, anything to say before we close out and say, I can't believe I'm going to say this, see you in December, which is wild. But yeah, Stephanie, anything to share with the group?
No, just thank you all for your thoughts. It's been a very thought-provoking day, and we will certainly continue to plug away, chisel away at what's a really hard issue. Just thank you.
Y'all, take care.